I really think Albert Einstein had it right when he said, assumptions are made and most assumptions are wrong. Hey, welcome to the Retirement Answer Man. My name is Roger Whitney. I'm so glad that you're here. This is the show dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement. We're here to help you rock retirement. Yes, the numbers are important, and we get into plenty of those, but it's about making intentional decisions to create a great life, regardless of what life throws at us. And this month, we have been talking about retirement assumptions in your planning, and we're going to end with 5 rules for making and managing your retirement assumptions. And then in our other segment, we're going to have our head retirement coach from the Rock Retirement Club, Beach Walker, come on and talk a little bit about identity. We've had some great meetups in the Rock Retirement Club on that. But before we do any of that, I want to have a quick message about what we're going to do next month and the Rock Retirement Club. So in the month of June, we are going to be exploring behavioral finance, the cognitive biases that we humans have that prevent us from achieving the things that we really want. So on the show, we're going to be spending the whole month on behavioral issues and making decisions. And in the Rock Retirement Club, our online community where we give world-class retirement education, and there's a little over 300 people just like you walking this life together and talking and sharing ideas so we can make better decisions. We're actually going to have a live meetup with Dr. Daniel Crosby, a New York Times bestseller and author of The Behavioral Investor. Dan is a wicked smart guy, and he's going to be joining us in the club. And you can check that out at rockretirementclub.com. Assumptions. Why do we have to make assumptions in planning? What are assumptions? Assumptions are basically guesses at things we don't know. We don't know how long we're going to live. We don't know what interest rates are going to be. We don't know what inflation is going to be. Those things are uncertain, so we have to make an assumption about them in order to plan. That sounds self-explanatory, but essentially, assumptions are a way to identify and manage the uncertainties, which is the essence of any kind of planning, which is the essence of retirement planning. If we didn't have uncertainties, we wouldn't have to make assumptions because we would know everything. See how critical these things are? So how do we make good assumptions? Well, let's focus on 5 rules for making and managing assumptions. So rule number 1 is recognize the assumptions you need to make. That seems pretty self-obvious, right? Well, first, we have to know what we don't know. Well, maybe that's not as easy as we think it might be. Inflation, rate of return, longevity. I mean, those are some of the easy pickings, and we try to tease out some of the more nuanced ones because there are a lot of assumptions that we unknowingly make in our lives that we need to reassess. We think it's so, but it's really not so. The spending rhythm is a good example, or the fact that you're not going to work ever again is a good example. And those are really hard to tease out because those assumptions are made on decisions or frameworks of thinking that you've had for maybe decades. So a simple example is if you take a piece of paper, don't do this while you're driving, and you draw 4 dots in the shape of a square. Okay, so you have 4 dots that make up a square. And the task is you put your pencil or pen down and you draw 3 lines that connect all 4 dots and come back to where you started the process. So where you put your pencil down. This is a little bit of a puzzle. How do I connect all 4 dots and bring my pencil or pen back to the point where I started by only drawing 3 lines? Some people have difficulty with this. And the answer is, so pause if you don't want the answer. The answer is you have to draw outside of the boundaries of the box. I'll put an example of it in 6-Shot Saturday. There are a lot of people that struggle with that because they have assumed incorrectly that the task meant that they had to stay within the boundaries that were set for them. And then as soon as they say, oh, I can go outside the lines, now I can get this done. Those are the really important assumptions in retirement planning. Oh, I don't have to live here anymore because I don't have that commute. Really? I could go live in the mountains? I can actually make that decision for myself? Sometimes we don't even have that aha moment because that assumption or that framework was put into place years before and we've just never questioned it. So step one, rule number one is we need to recognize the assumptions you need to make and some of the assumptions that you're making without realizing it, right? So that's step one. What are the uncertainties that I have to make a guess on? And then step two is, or rule number two, is we need to determine and investigate and gather information on making that assumption. And step two is go investigate and find data on making that assumption. So let's take longevity as an example. How do we assume longevity? Well, if we're going to go maybe start with the historical data, looking at the life expectancy tables, that's a great place to start. And maybe that's good enough. We just use the historical data. But if we want to take that a step further in terms of longevity, well, I don't smoke, so that changes it. I exercise, I'm not on medication, do some of the more specific longevity assessments. That may give you a more nuanced view of the assumption of how long you might live. It may be worthy to go beyond the historical data. Whereas if we're talking about market assumptions and we look at the historical data, we have to decide for ourselves, does it make sense to go predict the future to get a more nuanced assumption here? My view is not. Yours may be different. So step two is go investigate and determine the data you're going to use to make that assumption. That's really important. And then you can make that assumption in a reasonable way. Rule number three, and this is a big one, beware of making extreme assumptions. Remember back in 1999, when we were all worried about the turn of the clock to 2000, and there was this huge institutional worry that, hey, I don't know if our computers are ready to turn the clock to 2000. It could blow up all the computer systems and technology could literally stop. This was a big deal back then for some. And we all know of an individual, or maybe we've heard a story of someone that was prepping the family for this event, and they were stockpiling food. They were pulling cash out of banks. They were setting up their lake or forest cabin for the safe house for when the world stopped. It got pretty serious with some. This extreme assumption that, man, when this happens, all the computers are going to stop and the world's changed forever. I remember with my family and young kids at the time, maybe I should take some cash out. I was not making this extreme assumption, but I took some cash out. I bought a few more macaroni and cheeses for the pantry. But some people took that to an extreme because they believed so strongly in this extreme assumption that the world was going to effectively end for a while because of this computer glitch, that they spent a ton of money, a ton of time, a ton of angst dealing with the assumption that they made. So that's one example of an extreme assumption. But a more impactful one when it comes to retirement planning can be had if we think about, we can think about 2099 again and 2008 because they're mirror images of each other, right? In 2099, the extreme assumptions, as we talked about, were this is a new economy and we expect to have 15 to 20% returns in equities on average because of the leverage of the internet. It's changed the entire world. We talked about that last week. And then in 2008, 2009, coming out of that, a lot of people made the extreme assumption of markets are dead. They're never coming back and there'll be no returns because we've leveraged the balance sheet, hyperinflation. And then both people on either side of that mirror acted on those extreme assumptions. And in the case of the 99 assumptions, many people retired thinking they could take 10% out a year and abandon all diversification, and they went broke, literally. And then on the flip side, after 2008, 2009, many people never got back into markets or purchased alternatives or structured products to protect against the next calamity and ended up losing, in some cases, millions of dollars over a 10-year bull market because the extreme assumption that was pretty logical, plausible, didn't occur. So the difficulty with the extreme assumptions is, in your planning anyway, is if you make an extreme assumption, well, you've just created a decision tree where you need to adjust. You may need to make all your other planning decisions based off of that extreme assumption. So you better get that assumption right. And you better get the timing of that assumption right in order for your plan to work. Highly recommend not making extreme assumptions, even now in the COVID crisis, when it is very plausible that suddenly stopping the world economies is going to have a huge trickle effect and put us into a big recession or even depression. That is plausible. I can make an intellectual case for that. But we get to timing and the multidimensional things. If you're going to make that assumption, that means you're going to act on that assumption. Better be right. You better be right on the timing. And this goes with tax rates, return rates, spending rates, longevity. I know people that said, I'm not going to live past 83. All my family didn't because of my ethnic background. It's not going to happen. Well, that's an extreme assumption to a point, because you're going to act like you're going to die at 83, and you may very easily overshoot it if you're wrong. That's rule number 3. Rule number 4, just as important. When we're looking at all of these assumptions that we're making, we need to determine which ones have the biggest impact, because they're all not equal. And not only which ones have the biggest impact, but we also want to determine which ones we can have the biggest impact on. This goes back to, first, identify the things that matter. Second, identify the things that you can control. And where they intersect is where you want to focus your time. So let's think of an example of this. If we think of inflation, right? Inflation, it can have a big impact on our retirement. Every dollar we spend year by year is going to deteriorate in purchasing power. So it can have a big impact if inflation is 2.8%, which it's been since 1926 on average, or whether it's 10%. But also we forget that Social Security adjusts to COLA to some extent, cost of living adjustments, and other income sources, whether it's dividends or other things, will ultimately adjust to that. So that mutes that impact a little bit, but it still has a big impact. Then we have to focus on, okay, if this has a big impact on us, we need to be aware of it, make a reasoned assumption. How much control do we have over inflation? Not a lot. I mean, we can control our personal inflation rate by swapping, the $20 bottle of wine for the $10 bottle of wine, or the branded product to the generic product, but we don't have really much control over it. So we want to pay attention to it, make a good assumption. We know it's important, but we can't focus there because there's not much we can do there. Same thing with tax rates, rates of return. We'll focus on how we behave better next month on the show and in the club. So what's an example of something that can have a huge impact and you have a lot of control over? I think it's spending. Spending is probably the most important assumption you're going to make in your retirement as far as impact. Your spending and the cycles of your spending in those needs, wants, and wishes, that's a huge determinant. If you can be happy and have a great life on $50,000 and not $100,000, it changes the dynamic of the plan. So that's a big lever you can pull. So the impact is big, and it's something that you can control. So that is obviously something we want to focus on a little bit more and have dialed in and make more nuanced assumptions there because of those two factors. It's a big impact and we have total control over it. In module 4, in the master class, we spend the entire module of making, okay, well, let's think about our spending. Let's think about the nuances of it. Let's do a top-down budget. Let's do a bottom-up budget. Let's do a spending timeline over the life of retirement. The reason we do those in the Google spreadsheet is because this is so important and we can control it. So that's rule number 4. Determine what has the biggest impact and which ones you can have the biggest impact on and focus on those most. And then rule number 5, don't trust your assumptions. And I'm laughing because assumptions are so important and we talked about them for a month, but you can't trust them. Because remember what we talked about at the beginning, assumptions. The reason we are making assumptions is because we have uncertainties that we can't solve for. And that is the nature of almost every project. You can't solve for a lot of things, so you need to make assumptions and you want to be reasonable about it. And we talked about it, but ultimately you can't trust them because they're uncertainties. They are going to be wrong. And I think that's one reason why we got to figure out what assumptions we need to make. So we know what we have uncertainties about. We need to make reasoned assumptions with data. We need to be wary of extreme assumptions. We need to know which ones are the most important assumptions and which ones we have control over. But ultimately, we can't trust them. And this is part of the reason of iteration, of being agile. If you can't trust them, you're going to want to have a framework in place so you can revisit them often. So if your inflation assumption is 3% and you check in a year later and it's running at 5%, you readjust your model. Maybe you keep your same assumption because remember, things never get average, but you start to be aware of, spending's going up. It's finding these little blips on our dashboard and iterating on them and revisiting our assumptions that is the key. And that's why we talk about agile. I think this is a really important discussion, but I also think this is a great setup for next month as we talk about the behavioral aspect of it, because that's going to be the humanness and how we go about making these assumptions. So now let's go to our next segment where we're going to bring on our head retirement coach, Beach Walker, and talk about what's going on in the club, but also talk about his thoughts on identity, because that's a big thing that we make assumptions about that changes drastically or can change in retirement. Well, it is the end of the month, so we are here with Beach Walker, the head retirement coach of the Rock Retirement Club. Beach Walker, I think we need your own theme music.
I like that idea.
Give me a style I'll come up with something, but I want you to choose the style because this is about you.
How about whimsical yet serious? Complete oxymoron.
Okay, well, and you're letting me choose, so we'll test something next month and we'll just have to iterate on that. So
why do I think you'll choose Monty Python or something?
So in the Rock Retirement Club, in addition to talking about retirement assumptions, we're talking about maybe one of the most important assumptions, which is who you're going to be. There's a default assumption in that. So why is identity such a big issue for retirees?
Well, it's really because retirement is such a confluence of changes that come along. Obviously, the big one, you lose your work identity. So you're no longer Dr. Smith or Fireman Jones. So you've lost that work identity. Even if you didn't have a big work identity, you're losing your role as a financial provider for your family. And so that's a big part of most people's identities. But the other factors that come into play, your kids are probably leaving the nest. So your identity as a parent is changing. For some people, they no longer think of themselves as young or even middle-aged. They're now old. They're retired. They're old. So that's a big change. And for others, they're becoming grandparents. And, that's really old, right? Grandparents are old. So all these things come together for retirees, and it really can take a hit to their identity and who they are.
And I think the getting old part, I'm 53 and I have to be careful of that. I can't do that anymore. And I can imagine the grandparent part of it. I know some people just embrace that's my identity, right? They just are all in on that.
Absolutely.
But on the flip side, it can feel old. I'm a grandparent.
That's right.
Now, you're not a grandparent yet.
I am not. Our youngest just got married, so my wife is counting down the days and reminding them to get busy. But other than that, we are not yet. The other thing I didn't mention, the physical changes. You're experiencing those, and those don't help with your identity as to what you can do. So all these things come together right around retirement.
So let's talk about you for a moment, if we may.
Ooh, okay.
So your identity, and I'm describing this, you have not self-described this. Actually, you're pretty humble about it, which is unusual for you. You were a fairly high-powered attorney in your career. You had a lot of awards. You did extremely well, and you retired not so long ago. And you seem to, my impression is your identity has become diving into helping others via the retirement coaching and in the club. Was that planned? Did you think through that beforehand? How did you take off one cape and put on another?
It is a work in progress. I'm getting very comfortable with my new identity, but I have to confess, around certain groups of people, I still occasionally will find myself wanting to insert into the conversation, I used to be a big attorney. And so that's still there, and you have to really fight that. So I'm not completely transitioned with my new identity, but I'm working on it.
And this is obviously a passion for you. This is not from an economical standpoint, not critical to your success in retirement or critical to your worth in your retirement coaching, at least by my assessment.
That's correct. I really do enjoy helping others, being helpful. And so I think to that extent, it is somewhat an extension of my legal career where I try to do that for my clients.
So I think of you in this example, and I think of Fritz, Retirement Manifesto, because he had a similar journey from high-end corporate he created his identity in exploring the planning part of it and then blogging on it. And I think those are great public examples. I'm curious if you can think of any examples that aren't so public and that are more, lack of a better term, mundane or normal.
Yeah. And part of it is what I was talking a minute ago. Not everyone has this work identity that is so obvious. I mean, if lawyers, doctors, firemen, police, their work identity is who they are. Not everyone has that kind of a job, but they still have that role as a provider for their family. And that's coming to an abrupt end. They're no longer going to be that. And so I think everyone faces this issue, some to a lesser extent than others.
So this comes to the next question. And this is related to a question we just literally had today in the club about someone who's taking the masterclass courses in the club. And they were like, I'm retiring in 2021. I'm paraphrasing. And I haven't really done much work about who I'm going to be after retirement. And then they're starting that journey. And it begs the question, do we really need a new identity?
Well, I don't like to think of it as a need so much as an opportunity. In other words, who do I want to be in retirement? It's not so much necessarily reinventing yourself, although a lot of people do that. I've done that to some extent. I don't think that's necessary, but I do think it's about rediscovering who you are and who you want to be. I think most of us, when we take on a career, we give up parts of our personality to be successful in that career. If not giving them up entirely, we put them on the back burner. I'm a pretty silly person. I like to cut up. I couldn't do that during my legal career. So I'm trying to rediscover my own sense of humor. And frankly, it became almost too mean as a lawyer. It's sarcasm. And I still try to catch myself not being too sarcastic. So I'm trying to rediscover those parts of myself that I sort of had put on the back burner.
And I think you hit on a really good point, because we have to put away some of those parts of ourselves to play the role in work. And if we're not intentional, we can forget, because those decisions, they're not made in a day. They just sort of happen. Like your attorney and being the serious guy has happened over time. It wasn't like a decision on a day, most likely. And we can forget that we had those portions of ourselves.
Exactly.
And I would say with you, because we've known each other almost 2 years now, is you are much more chill than we first met. I had the hardest time figuring you out, because you can be very serious and intense like me. And I've noticed that with you. So bravo there.
Part of it, I will give credit to my dear wife, who, after I retired, would remind me, you don't have to be so serious. You don't have to be so intense about things. And it was something I already knew I needed to do, but it's nice having that reminder.
Yeah, definitely home and center. And then hopefully between Tracy, Nicole, and Crazy Kevin and myself in the club, we can hold you accountable for that too.
Exactly. And you're all good role models for what I'm trying to get to.
And that question from the lady in the club, thinking about this, and this came from, we released module 4, which was to do a lot of what you're talking about. I know you're hosting a meetup in the club with members to sort of work through this, is re-examining yourself. We have a lot of exercises in the course and in the meetups to come up with what that new identity might be, or how you can experiment to find that out. And the question that the lady had was, it was framed, and maybe I just interpret it this way. It's like, I have to figure this out. And that may be not necessarily the most healthy way of doing it, right?
Right. And my advice is focus on your gifts. What are the things that you do well and really enjoy? And it's not necessarily talents, although it certainly includes talents, but it just may be your personality traits. What makes you happy when you have this mood or this trait? Then get in touch with your purpose. And I think of purpose as something that's very meaningful to you, that contributes in some way to other people, or making a difference in some cause that you support or you really care about. And if you can combine your gifts, the things you do well, with your purpose, then all you need to do is figure out opportunity to use those gifts and apply them toward that purpose. And you've found your perfect identity in retirement and can pursue it.
And then to wrap this up around assumptions in retirement.
Yes.
You asked me to ask you a question, and you would not share what you think the answer is. That wasn't very nice of you. You're going to surprise me in court. What is the most important assumption we make in retirement, was the question.
Well, this is one where I always try to bring you facts and research. I don't have that now. This is intuition. But I heard you talking about on the podcast longevity assumptions that you need to make in your retirement plan. and how if you want to assume an average lifespan, it's 83 or 84. If you want to get to the 70th percentile, it might be 90, et cetera, et cetera. And that longevity assumption you make about yourself can have a profound effect on how much money you have to spend under your plan to make sure it will last. Well, that made me think back. Remember the conversation we had last month about how your perception of aging can have a big effect on how long you live? Okay, so I'm thinking of these, and it occurred to me that our own belief about how long we might live may well become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And because I do believe our attitudes affect outcomes. And I think our beliefs about how long we'll live might be able to impact how long we'll live. So, you know what I did? I went into my retirement plan and I changed my assumption from 90 to 115. So I'm trying to believe that now.
I think I have an exercise for you with that I learned in Strategic Coach. So remind me to send you that worksheet. And if I copyright wise can share it with others, I'll do that. That is exactly on that point.
Perfect. I really think it's part of our perception of aging, right? How we're aging. But I also just think, look, if for 20 or 30 years of retirement, you focused on this age 87, whatever you put into your retirement plan, I wonder if you don't tend to get close to that age. So that's why I'm shooting for 115, Roger.
I think that there's something to that. And I think what I would add to that is it's not just an age. There's the attitude of what the quality of that life will be.
Absolutely.
And crap happens to all of us. Some really bad stuff happened to some of us. And it's interesting to watch. And this pandemic and how that's impacted different people has been a little bit of a side case study or a study for myself because I've had so many interactions. How we view things, and you talked about this, I believe, last month, how we view things impacts our attitudes about everything. Sort of, am I viewing everything half full or half empty? It brings to mind, and I saw the headline, I didn't read the story of it was like a 90-something-year-old veteran, and it might actually have been in England, where he was out raising money for healthcare workers during the pandemic and the response in England. And he could hardly walk. He had all the issues a 90-something-year-old guy is going to have that was a veteran. But his attitude was one of being of service, and he was a half full kind of guy.
And he was probably thinking about what he was going to do in service next year, right?
That's the point, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Always great to have you, and I'm excited for this meetup. I think we're doing it on the 18th of May in the club. So by the time that we just did that, because we're recording this a little bit early. But the cool thing is in the club, we have the replays where we can all share the experience and continue the conversation.
Talk to you next month, Roger.
All right, buddy.
On your marks, get set.
And you're off to set a little baby step for the next 7 days to rock retirement and rock life. So in the next 7 days, just get out a scratch piece of paper and go through these rules and think about, go through rule number 1. What assumptions do you need to make in your retirement planning? And which ones are you making and you're unaware of it? Because you've made, whether maybe it's where you live or that your portfolio is optimized for where you want to go. Look at some of the things that you've already decided in the past that are the structures of your life and just take a list and just start to brainstorm what assumptions do you need to make? And that's going to help you work through these rules and be more thoughtful so you can rock retirement. Okay, so it's already started. Nicole is about to go on maternity leave, birth of her new son here any day now. And she's going to be gone for about 2 months. And we're going to have to get through this together. We're going to have to get through this on the show together. I'm going to bring on some special guests to help me in the question and answer session period. And I think that's going to be fun, but it's not going to be Nicole. So let's all wish her the best. I'm sure she'll give some shout outs in 6 Shot Saturday. And I appreciate all your prayers for her and her family. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize it's helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.